Perfect. Hopefully everybody can see the shared screen right now, which is essentially a PowerPoint presentation. So as I mentioned, welcome to our first Iris Center Morning Bytes meeting. Okay, you can advance the slide. The topic for today is, or I think I have a slide before the topic for today. Just for those of you who are newcomers to the Morning Bytes series, these are a series of informal and presentations and discussions about a variety of topics connected to the digital humanities and social sciences. Sometimes they're presentations of projects, and sometimes they're discussions about general or broader topics that connect to DH and social sciences. Sometimes they're tutorials or tools tips. Today's talk is kind of a combination of general issues as well as some tips and tools. They're roughly once monthly, and like I said, for now, they're going to be online on Zoom. And then we'll post materials to our IRIS website after, which is the workshops link if you just go to the IRIS page in general. Okay, next slide. So today's topic is making DH projects accessible. So we'll get into what accessible means and all of the issues that are tied to accessibility. But first, I just want to introduce our group. So I'm Kristine Hildebrandt. I'm one of the directors, the co-director of the IRIS Center at SIUE. Meg, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Meg Smith. I'm an assistant professor of digital humanities in the IRIS Center. And the IRIS Center is essentially our Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences. And then Daniel.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Flaum. I'm an undergraduate computer science student here. I'm in my senior year. I'm volunteering with the IRIS Center to work on some projects of theirs. This is one of them. Another is a digital archive project the stuff that we talk about here in today's brown bag is actually going to apply to.
Yeah, we're really grateful to have Daniel on board. As Daniel mentioned, he's involved in a couple of projects, and we think it's a really nice example of faculty-student collaboration in a peer-like kind of setting. Daniel is teaching us a lot about web customization and accessibility, and just how to integrate a number of the web encoding demands into various types of digital humanities and social science projects. So we're really grateful to have him here. Okay, why don't we move on to the next slide? I'll be doing some just kind of talking for just a couple of minutes, then I'll turn it over to Daniel, and then we will move things over to Meg, who will finish the talk today. So a bit of context or background behind this presentation today. I have seen, and my colleagues have been seeing, a number of a growing number, first of all, of out-of-the-box tools for designing websites, building websites, along with a growing interest from all kinds of different people from all different types of backgrounds about building websites, designing websites for various causes, various needs. And so there's a growing need, and there are a number of out-of-the-box tools, and on some level, those tools make it easier for newcomers to get involved in web design. They don't have to know a whole lot, for example, about code or website architecture, infrastructure. However, that's also the same drawback. They can mask the structure of a website, which can cause some real accessibility problems over time and really shut out certain types of potential users. So the talk is really partly about the basics of understanding what web accessibility means, and then we'll follow up with some tips and tools. Let's see, so a few key concepts that are kind of behind this broader notion of what accessibility is. It really is a broad category that encompasses a number of key concepts that I have listed here. In particular, the concept of usability, about making things that people can use safely and effectively, and also pleasurably, right? You want to get some joy and information and interest out of building your website and making it available to others. Accessibility broadly, which I'll return to, is usability for different types of users, a broad and varied base of users. Particularly taking into account the ways that digital spaces can potentially exacerbate disability-related barriers to access and other types of barriers. And then inclusion is not only about making things but constructing your web space and your community of users to fully involve and engage different types of users more actively. And then universal design has to do with creating spaces that are inclusive to the greatest possible number of users right from the beginning, rather than coming back and addressing issues one by one or as a luxury as a negotiable. We want to try to kind of get things accessible right from the very beginning. Returning to accessibility just a little bit more, there's a lot at stake in terms of this general sense of accessibility. Basically, accessible websites are digital spaces that have the maximal number of resources. They're important and they can advance scholarship and access to scholarly materials, both production and access to on the other end. Obviously, accessible web pages are important to broader academic spaces and discourses. They should allow this kind of back and forth flow of information. And also, accessible web pages involve a broader and more inclusive sense of community. And as mentioned here, accessibility is often thought of as an afterthought. It's often not accounted for example, in a budget or in a planning scenario. If somebody is including web design as part of a project or as part of program development, or in terms of even class preparation. So it's often thought of as something that it's not often thought about, actually. And when it is thought about, it's often thought about in a rather ad hoc or after the thought way. Therefore, it's often not incorporated in early website design. And so this talk today is kind of giving people food for thought and tips for use in terms of early website development. Okay, the next slide. Undergirding all of undergirding this larger aspect of accessibility are what are known as the POUR principles. So this is a general framework or set of principles that is widely embraced in web design spaces. So if you Google the POUR principles, you'll see a number of different groups and web stewardship sites right away talk about the POUR principle. So POUR stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Operable means that users should be able to see, hear, or otherwise sense what is on a page and not have kind of no idea, about what is contained. Understandable means, what they understand the content that is actually on the page. It's comprehensible. Operable, whoops, I went backwards. Sorry, I'm doing a 132. Operable has to do with users being able to use the navigation intuitively and clearly, and also the user interface is clear and intuitive. And then finally, robust. It should work reliably across different devices, different operating systems, and also work with different types of assistive technologies that different users are making sense of. Let's see, I don't think I have a next slide. Can you advance just so I can see what the next slide is? Yeah, that's going to be from Daniel. I just want to say another couple of things before I turn things over to Daniel. Yeah, so basically, we're going to be talking about some tangible, actionable things that practitioners can do to make websites more accessible. And also, it's useful to note here that we're going to be using some demos and some simulators, and they are quite useful, that the ones we're going to be showing you when you're kind of in the middle of designing and building your web page, but they're not ultimately a substitute for talking to people and interacting with people about your web design experiences and what it is, what the results of what you're actually building. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, sorry, I did a little bit of skipping there. I didn't realize my notes were out of order. So I think what I'm going to do is hand it over to Daniel next, and then, like I said, we're going to make a number of these materials available afterwards. All right, Daniel, take it away.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hildebrandt. I just want to check real quick. People can hear me just fine?
I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Could I have the next slide, please, Meg, or Dr. Smith? Okay. So Dr. Hildebrandt just explained, what's the big picture? What are we trying to do here?
Oh, Daniel, your sound is a bit muted. I don't know if you can.
How about now?
That's much better.
Sorry about that. For some reason, my microphone keeps wanting to reset its volume. So Dr. Smith Dr. Hildebrandt had just explained.
It just reset it again, Daniel.
How about now?
It's working now.
Hang on, I'm going to open my microphone's volume in a separate window and watch it because I think it's trying to automatically adjust if I set it too high.
I see.
All right. Anyway, Dr. Hildebrandt had just explained a framework that we're going to use to try and improve the accessibility of web pages. I'm going to show you sort of the details of the technical details of a web page so that you can get an idea of what the core framework is going to operate on. You know, what's the goal? What are we actually doing when we try to make a web page easier to use and more accessible? And one of the ways to start that is to just cover what a web page actually is, just to sort of draw the boundaries of where we're working in. Now, a web page is a document, very much like print media. You know, it has all the things that you're familiar with: headers, paragraphs, tables, etc. So all your knowledge and skills about creating print documents apply. However, web pages are also hyperlinked. And this allows one web page to link to any other web page. And it doesn't matter who created the web page or what website it's a part of. You can create complex structures that link different kinds of publications together. And besides that, web pages can also have other kinds of media in them. They can have audio, they can have video, they can have interactive displays. And for those, you need new knowledge and skills on top of your print skills so that you can take full advantage of web pages. Could I have the next slide, please? So crafting print documents is easy, you know, for a given value of easy, because what you have to do is get the desired arrangement of unchanging ink or pixels in front of your audience. But writing web pages is harder, because in order to get all those other features that I talked about, hyperlinks, audio, video, interactive displays, they need to be described in a format that a computer can interpret and then display in some way to a user. And so that means that if you're writing web pages, if you're working specifically with web pages, you're going to be writing code that's going to be used by a computer to create a representation that's used by an user. And there could be different representations of that page for different people. You're probably already familiar with seeing websites that look, they have one layout on a desktop or laptop computer, but they have a more restricted layout on phones. You can also design web pages that are intended to be represented orally. That is, they can be spoken out loud. If your web page has an image, you know, obviously an image can't be, you know, spoken. So you might add a representation of that image that's verbal so that the computer can read it out to an user. What all of this means is that when you're creating a web page, there isn't like just a single appearance. It's not where the content and the representation are one and the same. Instead, you have to arrange for code that could be displayed to the user visually. It might be read out to an user orally. It might appear on a Braille display for blind users, for example. What this means is what you see isn't what you get, unlike in print media. Could I have the next slide, please? So to give you an idea of what that specifically means, I'm going to show you an example. And if you don't have any computer programming or computer language skills, don't worry. You don't have to memorize all the details. This is just an illustrative example. So a web page most commonly has two kinds of code. It has one kind of code that stores and structures the content, the stuff that will appear in some fashion on the web page. And it will have a different kind of code that describes how the content should appear. So you can see on the left, we have code that obviously applies to a shopping list. We can see that we have a title, the P that you see roughly in the middle of it, where it says, here's a list of groceries. The P tags indicate that that's a paragraph. The UL tags indicate an unordered list, and the LI tags indicate list items. So we have a shopping list. Here's a list of groceries. It's got tomatoes, milk, and Vegemite on it. But on the right, we see code that describes how this should appear when it's rendered in the browser. For example, the paragraph should receive text of a certain size. The unordered list has a list style type of square. That means it should have square bullets. And we also specify that if a list item has a class, like in classification of got it, then its text should be decorated with strike through. Now, if you could go to the next slide, please, Dr.
Hello?
Smith. Hello? All right. what I've just done is replaced the code on the left, the content code, with a tree view of what that code represents, where you have a sort of a hierarchy. You have things inside other things. So for example, the head of the document where meta information about the document appears has the title. Then there's the body, which has the paragraph and an unordered list in it. So when you're working with that kind of code, you're creating this sort of tree structure that organizes your content. You can imagine if we had like a book chapter, for example, we might have elements that correspond to chapters in the book, to titles in there. Images would also appear in this tree. And if we go to the next slide, a web browser, when it receives these two kinds of code, will combine them. It will figure out what styles need to apply to what elements according to the rules in the style code that appeared on the right. And when they're combined together and rendered, they can create a representation like you see in the lower left-hand corner. And what this is to illustrate is just that a web page is content that is presented in some way. If I had a screen reader, the screen reader would be smart enough to say, you know, you're looking at a web page, its title is a shopping list, here's its content, and then it would speak the paragraph and the list. And this means if content is presented, if your content is presented in some way in a web page, but it could be one of multiple ways, then that means you need to consider how to make your content and your presentation accessible separately. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, you generally don't write this code. You generally use software which will write this code for you. Some you may have heard of before are WordPress, Omeka, Scalar. Blackboard technically counts as this kind of software. It's a more specialized application. The same with MediaWiki, which is the software that is used to run Wikipedia. And these are all examples of a class of software called content management systems. The idea is you create your content. You might do it inside the CMS, or you might do it, you know, in a Word document or wherever you like. Then you upload your content to the CMS, and the CMS will write the code that I showed you by combining your content with a system of templates, usually called a theme. And then the CMS will usually also serve the code to your users' web browsers when the users come to your website and visit it. Could I have the next slide, please? The problem is that content management systems, although they make your life much easier, you don't have to deal with code nearly so much or even at all, they generally write code mechanically, not intelligently. A CMS can't look at an image and generate a verbal description for you. It also doesn't know necessarily how your website should appear on a desktop computer versus a mobile computer. So unless the CMS is instructed on how to generate code that's appropriate for the different representations that we described, then, for example, mobile users might be left out in the cold because all they get to look at is this tiny miniaturized desktop version where they have to pinch and zoom in and out to look at different pieces of the page. And users with vision impairments might be left outside the solar system entirely. They may have no way to access the page if it is particularly reliant on images or videos, for example. Could I have the next slide, please? So what do we do then if we want to improve accessibility, since we're not writing the code? Well, we need to give the CMS instructions in some way that helps it make these presentations. And generally, this breaks down into two different kinds of activities. One, you're going to want to choose a theme for your CMS that has accessibility built into it. A theme, remember, is a bundle of the two kinds of code that I showed you and some other stuff. And that code itself can be written ahead of time to make it accessible. And I'll show you some examples of things that make a page accessible that appear in the theme in a future slide. But other times you're going to be adding content to your code, or I'm sorry, adding extra content to your content that explains what to do in certain circumstances. So for example, if you have an image on your page, it's going to be you who has to provide the verbal description of the image. The theme can't take care of that for you. So two things: choosing the right theme in order to make your website more accessible generally, and then actually enhancing your content itself to make it more accessible specifically. Could I have the next slide, please? So that was kind of vague, but to give you some more concrete examples of what that translates into, I've been talking about how images and videos need verbal descriptions or transcripts that will make them perceptible to hearing users who will have trouble seeing that content. Links often need descriptions of where they lead to in order to make them more operable and understandable. This doesn't apply to every link. Many links are self-explanatory. If a link says, go here to learn more, that doesn't necessarily need more examples. But if you want to make a single word a link, and it just goes to an article or somewhere, you might want to give that single word link a description so that people can get a better sense of where they're going ahead of time. Usually for sighted users, if you mouse over that link, the description of it would appear in a tooltip underneath it. And then the whole page also needs added navigation features for operability. And this is stuff where your theme would kick in. Your theme would probably add a link to the page, in order to give hearing users a way to go quickly to the content and skip the page header with all its navigation. Your content, it should also have a table of contents, and there should be a quick way to get that. And there should also probably be a link that helps users get to the page footer, because oftentimes, expanded navigation, more details like a sitemap will appear in the footer, as well as meta things like privacy policies that people might be interested in. And all of this is done by properly configuring your CMS, choosing a good theme and taking advantage of it, and then consistently using your CMS to make sure that when you upload your content, you take care to make it accessible to other users. Could I have the next slide, please? So real quick, just a summary of what I just covered. You create your content. You can do this with whatever tools you're most comfortable with. If you like Word or Google Drive or whatever you please, you can use paint programs to make images or however you get your multimedia assets. You should use, your good writing skills and your visual design skills, if you have them, in order to make your content itself accessible to users. Because like I've talked a lot about mostly people with seeing problems as the example through the slides that I've discussed, but there are also other kinds of disabilities, mobility disabilities as well as cognitive disabilities, and making sure that your content is written well can help with that understandability in the core framework. Once you have your content, you upload it to your CMS where you've chosen a theme that supports perceptibility and operability by making it easy to move around the website. And you'll also use the CMS's features to make sure that the content, when it is rendered into a web page, includes all the information it needs to be made accessible, for example, to users who need to hear your web page. After that, the CMS takes care of generating the two kinds of code that I showed you that contain all the information that a computer needs to know how to display it on large screens, small screens, how to render it in an audio form or for a Braille keyboard, all that jazz. So that's the general framework of what we're doing. And now I'm going to turn you over to Meg, who's going to demonstrate us actually doing this on a site that we created for this presentation. So Dr. Smith, if you're ready to go.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me switch my screen share over here. So one of the platforms that we use a lot with our faculty, with our students, is WordPress. It's very easy to set up. It's a nice sort of very user-friendly CMS. Also has a lot of accessibility features built in. So that's what I'm using today to sort of demonstrate a few of these things in action. That said, a lot of the principles apply across the board to various CMSs and also to other sort of more custom tools. And as you can see, we've also kind of built this out a little bit to have some various resources that you can look at after the chat as well. So here we are with an accessibility demo here. So I have designed this page to be as inaccessible as possible, which is actually very difficult on WordPress. So just right off the bat, does anyone want to jump in with anything that they see as I scroll through here? If not, I'll talk, don't worry. But okay, so I have some things that I did to make it problematic. So first, we've got this kind of busy header up here, so we can kind of start at the top. It's busy, the text blends in here very badly, and so it's, you've got very low contrast between the colors, combined with that busy background, makes it kind of hard to read this, especially if you don't perceive color as well. And we also have this little subheading here that I found when I tried a screen reader. Not only does it blend in here, but the screen reader actually skips it. And since we've got a little bit of actual meaningful content in that subheading, Web Accessibility Standards for Digital Projects, that's problematic just to start with. As we move through here then, we also have some low contrast between these little page titles and the bar. So we've got some color issues here. And so as we scroll through, we've got some things that are good, right? So WordPress handles things like titles and headings. And so it kind of builds all of that in. All of those things are declared. So if you're using a screen reader, it will say title and accessibility demo, heading, what's the page's function. I have kind of skipped some heading levels here, which can be a little bit tricky for navigation if you're using a screen reader. So we would want to standardize that. But then we come to these images here. So this image, if you are a sighted user, you can kind of get a sense of what this image is for, right? It gives you kind of a list of topics, of categories of accessibility for the web. However, it comes with a number of issues for accessibility. For one thing, although you can't see it here if you're using this as a sighted user who's just sort of perceiving the page visually, there's no alternative text or description here. And so if you are not perceiving it visually, there's nothing to tell you what this image is. On top of that, we've got these different colors in here, and as you'll see when I scroll down, we've got some other color coding on this page, which sort of implies that color might, convey meaning. In this case, it doesn't, but that's not clear either. It's also very jargony. So from an understandability standpoint, there's nothing here to really give this any context or, add any layers of meaning. So as a standalone image, it really adds nothing to this site, and in fact might kind of pose an obstacle to some users. This image, also no alt text and no description. You can see here, if you're looking at it, that this is a mobile version of the site. And again, WordPress is pretty good with accessibility, and most of their themes are designed to be mobile compatible. This was the oldest theme I could find. This is the 2013 WordPress theme. And that might be why this doesn't quite work with this header. We've got the subtitle of the page kind of trailing off, and the header isn't displaying quite right. Otherwise, it looks okay. But again, nothing to really tell you that if you're not looking at it. So down here, I've added some text to kind of talk about what's happening on this page, and I've color coded it. So that red, obviously, is things that are inaccessible, things that are harming the page's accessibility. Green is the one good thing that WordPress has these built-in navigational tools, and then yellow is something that would be fine for sighted users who are sort of working through the text or through the page visually, but does exclude people who are not doing that. Now, the color coding in itself is problematic, right? If you were to look at this page through a simulator that, let's see. So if we look at this with a color simulator, obviously that meaning that's added by the color is gone. That is completely inaccessible. You cannot really tell what colors here are, what those colors are saying about this text. That is exacerbated by the fact that I have not included any language in these points here to tell you whether these are good or bad. So not only is that color adding meaning that is not accessible, but I haven't even explained it for anyone who's looking at it, even if they can perceive those colors. So lots of issues there. And I saw your question, and that is Funkify. I'll come back to that in a second. It's a Chrome extension. So what do we do with this? This site could have been okay if I had used some of the built-in tools, but instead I went out of my way to make it inaccessible. And that might seem a little bit contrived, but also, you know, when we're designing sites, we make all kinds of choices for aesthetic reasons, or because we think it's gonna, you know, convey meaning in some interesting or innovative way, not really thinking about the other impacts of those choices. So let's see what we can do to improve this. First, we can let the platform do its job by going in and removing that custom CSS. So that'll improve the color contrast. So if we get rid of that, let's see. So we can see our standards, our little page titles here are back to being black on a light background, which is much better. We can change this heading back to something a little bit clearer. And again, as someone who doesn't have issues with color perception, that's also much easier for me to read. We can also get rid of, or in this case, we're going to get rid of that color coding just because, again, it doesn't actually add meaning in any useful way. That's not to say that like you should never use color coding, but do always consider what the impact of those colors is and make sure that you're providing that meaning in other ways. So just do a couple of these here. So for instance, if I wanted to color code these, I should make sure that I'm using colors besides yellow that would not be visible, that have very low color contrast. But also I should include something in here. So for instance, break these out into good things, bad things, okay things, add that meaning in some other way. Because again, we're always trying to provide this content in ways that are, if not identical, at least equivalent for all potential users of the site. So that helps. We can come in here and add some alt text and some description. Captions also are a really easy way to not only talk about what the image is, but what it's doing on your page. What is the point of it? Even if things are purely decorative, you'll often see you know, in the alt text boxes on Twitter, for instance, or on WordPress, they'll say, you know, only add the alt text if it's not purely decorative. Even if it is decorative, I think it's useful to describe at least what it is. So here we can say, you know, image of accessibility related terms. We would want to like flesh that out if I weren't doing this live, but something at least to talk about what this image is and what it's doing on our page. So that already is going to be a little bit better. Let me see if I had anything else that I wanted to add here. We would standardize the headings. Again, I realize we're coming up on time here. Standardize the headings, maybe just so that they're consistent across the board. And that goes a long way towards just using the tools that are already embedded in WordPress. The last thing that I would say we want to do here then is to run it through some accessibility checkers and see if we've missed things. The one that I like is the Wave tool, which is from the Web Accessibility Initiative. I can't remember what the M is. I use this for other things also. And that will give us kind of a rundown of some of the outright errors and then also some alerts. And then it'll also tell us the things that WordPress is doing that are good. So if we click on details here, it's going to tell us I skipped a heading level. That could be an issue for screen readers and other tools that are navigating this page. It's telling us that, you know, we have a couple things here that don't have alternative text. But that is an option there. We do have a skip link that you can't actually see if you're looking at the page, but if you use a screen reader, it will offer the option to sort of skip past some of this content. And we have a section that tells it where to go. So we've got all of these tools built in here. This is a really nice way to get sort of an initial sense of where you're at with your website. It's not perfect. When I ran this through the first time, it didn't pick up any contrast issues, even though there were clear contrast issues. Every now and then it'll miss something. I also will occasionally use a disability simulator, like the one that I showed earlier, and that is called Funkify. And it offers, as you see, several different options. So things like dyslexia. So looking at how that might impact people using your site, or a hand tremor, which makes it harder to control the mouse. And so thinking about how users with those disabilities might then be using your site, what things on your site might be helping or hindering the functionality there. Those can be a useful way to sort of address some of these issues from the start. Another one that I have over here is Silktide, similar thing, especially looking at vision issues. So those are good tools. However, I want to reiterate, as Kristine said at the beginning, that those are not substitutes for actually talking to people, right? That these are tools that have been programmed, but they're working with a fairly limited set of not even real experiences, right? They're sort of parsing what someone else has told tools these experiences might look like. So always be working in to your project design, user feedback. That might look like sending out surveys to your users. It might look like sending it around to your friends and colleagues. It might look like looking at reviews of similar sites and seeing if there are other issues that people are raising, but certainly folding in actual people and their lived experiences and their experiences of your sites and of the web in general is the most crucial thing. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there and we can have some time for questions. And I would love to hear about experiences or suggestions or tips that you all have as we sort of talk through some of these things.